So today we are going to talk about the international trade of economics, and we will be focusing on the Chinese overcapacity and the Chinese dumping of aluminum in the US domestic market. The whole story starts in early 2016 when the Chinese government gave a great amount of subsidy to the Chinese domestic aluminum producers. This resulted in the overcapacity of the Chinese aluminum producers. In order to deal with the overcapacity, the Chinese producers as well as the government decided to start a dumping action on the United States domestic market of aluminum. So in this commentary, we will explain the reason behind the Chinese overcapacity of aluminum, and we will also explain the dumping's effect on the US economy and its labor market. So now we'll look at the effect of subsidy on the Chinese producers without the international trade. So we are only looking at the Chinese producer here. So it's only the domestic market in China without the influence of international trade. So as you can see here, the subsidy really shifts the the supply curve to the right. You can see here I'm driving down the price from P3 to P2. This really increases the revenue of Chinese producers. The Chinese producers' revenue before the imposition of the subsidy is the square here from P1 and Q1. So it's P1 multiplied by Q1 is the initial revenue of Chinese producers. And after the imposition of the subsidy, Chinese producers really benefit from a increased revenue. So the revenue increases from the area of P1 multiplied by Q1 to the area of P3 multiplied by Q2. So now the Chinese producers have a greater revenue, and as we can see here, the shaded area, the blue shaded area here, is the revenue paid by the Chinese government. So that's the cost of the subsidy, and this also generates an opportunity cost for the Chinese government, as they could have spent the money on, for example, healthcare and other kind of stuff. So we will first look at the world trade versus domestic market diagram here, and now we are looking at the domestic market with the influence of international trade of the Chinese market. Please notice this is the Chinese market for now. It's not the US market. And as you can see here, the red linear lines here is the supply curve of the domestic Chinese aluminum producers before the imposition of the subsidy. Please notice that's before the imposition of the subsidy. And then this linear line here is the domestic demand curve of the Chinese domestic consumers. And as we know that the Chinese producers produce over 50% of the world production of aluminum, so we can say that the Chinese producers basically lead the world price, and at least their domestic price of aluminum will be around the world price. So in our diagram, we just assume that the Chinese domestic producers of aluminum set the world price. So as a result, as we can see here, the equilibrium price between these domestic supply and the domestic demand will meet at the same price level as the world price, which is the P world. So this means that the domestic equilibrium price of aluminum will be the same as the world price of aluminum. And now the Chinese government imposes a subsidy to the Chinese producers, as we can see here. So this really helps the supply of the Chinese production of aluminum to shift to the right, as you can see in the graph, from the red linear line to the green linear line, from the S domestic. So this really drives down the price of aluminum in the Chinese domestic market. And as you can see now, the domestic price of aluminum in the Chinese market is much lower than the P world, which is the world price. So the subsidy definitely make the Chinese domestic producers much more competitive in the international trade market, as we can see from the first graph that we have gone through, that the Chinese producers are able to produce at a lower price and a greater quantity, as you can see here. So they are much more competitive than the international producers abroad. So, however, for the Chinese market, there is like an oversupply of aluminum in the market, as the consumers don't really demand that great amount of aluminum, and this results in the Chinese overcapacity in aluminum. So the definition of overcapacity is the situation in which an industry or factory, so in this case the Chinese aluminum industry, cannot sell as much as its plant that is designed to produce. So the Chinese aluminum producers produce way much more aluminum than the aluminum actually demanded by the consumers, and this really results in a problem, as the producers can't really sell all those aluminum and they have to do something about it. So this really becomes a problem for the Chinese producers as well as the Chinese government, as there are so many supplies and not as many quantity demanded. So then the Chinese government came up with a solution that dumped these extra aluminum on the foreign markets, for example the US domestic market of aluminum, and this can really help the Chinese producers to relieve the loss from the overcapacity.
Dumping is the practice of selling a product to a foreign country for a price that is less than the domestic price, or less than the cost of production of making that product. To understand better the problem at hand, let's have a look at this graph. So this graph could represent the aluminum market in the US. If there was no trade, well, we can ignore then that curve, and if there was no trade, domestic producers would produce the equilibrium quantity of aluminum for the equilibrium price. But as there is trade, well, then the domestic producers have to take the world price, which is lower than the domestic price, than what would be the domestic price with no trade. But for that price, and with their cost of production, domestic producers can only produce quantity Q1, but demand is quantity Q2. Therefore, the rest has to be imported. But first, let's have a look at what is the actual world price of a ton of aluminum. So this graph shows the world price for a ton of aluminum during the past 10 years, and for the time that interests us, well, it is from 2015 to 2016. Then we can see that in November 2015, well, the ton of aluminum reached the price of $1,467.89, which was the lowest it had gotten since, well, more than 5 years. As you can imagine, this kind of price can put pressure on American aluminum smelters. So now, what is the significance of China in that issue? The article that we studied tells us that China supplies 54% of the global aluminum production, or at least it did in 2016. It means that it gives China a great influence over the world price. So, given the world price, US aluminum producers will not be able to supply the quantity that is demanded at the world price. They will only be able to supply Q1, as said before. Actually, in reality, and at the time the article was written, this would represent about 1/3 of the total. The rest, the 2 remaining thirds, will of course be imported.
So now we are looking at the Chinese dumping of actual aluminum on the US domestic market. And, and now we are looking at the diagram of the, the US domestic market of aluminum with the influence of international trade. And this diagram is really similar to the imposition of tariff diagram, but it's like really different from the tariff diagram. And so as you can see here, it's the S domestic, which is the supply curve of the domestic US aluminum producers, and that's the demand, which is the demand of aluminum in the domestic US market. And before the Chinese dumping of aluminum on the US domestic market, um, this is the supply of the world producers, this here linear line that is parallel to the quantity axis here as world pre-dumping, and this creates the P World 1, which is the world price before the Chinese dumping on the US domestic market. As we know that the Chinese producers produce almost the vast majority of the aluminum in the world market, so we just assume that the Chinese producers set the world price in our diagram. So as we talked about it earlier, that the Chinese producers are now more competitive, are able to produce aluminum at a greater quantity and also at a lower price. And this drives down the world price from P World 1 to P World 2. And this also drives down the world supply curve from S world pre-dumping to S world post-dumping. So this results in a much lower world price of aluminum, as well as a greater quantity of production of aluminum in the world. And as these great amount of aluminum enter the US market, we can see that the domestic US producers suffer from a great loss. Before the dumping of aluminum on the US domestic market, US domestic producers are able to gain a revenue of P World 1 multiplied by Q3, which is this large area here. And as the Chinese dumping occurs in the US domestic market, the revenue earned by the US domestic producers shrinks to this area, which is only the P World 2 multiplied by Q1. So as we can see now, the US producers suffer as they make a lower revenue from their business. So under the influence of the Chinese dumping the US domestic market of aluminum, lots of individual US firms that are less efficient as the Chinese firms, I mean, because the Chinese have the subsidy, would have to face the situation to be shut down. And the reason behind the shutdown is this. Once the price level goes below the AVC, which is the average variable cost, the loss the firm will have to run the business will be much higher than the loss the firm will suffer if they just shut down the business. Because as you can see from the graph, the P1 is the price when the firm is supposed to be shut down. At this point, there is a production of Q1, and P1 multiplied by Q1 is the revenue the firm will gain from running the business, and at the same time, the total cost the firm will suffer when they continue the business. It's this huge box here, from one up to its intersection with the ATC, which is the average total cost. But however, if the firm now shuts down and not runs any business, it will suffer from a smaller loss, because if they shut down, the only loss they will suffer from will be the fixed cost, which is this area over here from P1 to this point, which is the intersection between this line and ATC, which is like this box here. So in theory, this box will be much smaller than the loss the firm will suffer from if the firm continues producing the goods and services.
A logical consequence of US firms that are producing aluminum shutting down or producing at a reduced capacity is that workers are being laid off, meaning that unemployment will increase. So the fact that a growing part of the US aluminum needs is satisfied by imports leads to the demand for workers of that field, to workers who are from that field to lower. So this is a consequence of the cost of production being lower in other countries and the world price being lower than a domestic price of production of aluminum. So what does that mean? Well, that means that we can identify what kind of unemployment we are dealing with, and this is actually structural unemployment. Structural unemployment is a type of equilibrium unemployment that occurs because of changes in the structure of an economy. Like the structure of any growing economy will change, and that means that demand for some jobs will increase and demand for other kinds of jobs will decrease. For example, in an economy, the demand for computer scientists might increase while the demand for another kind of job, here we can take our example, aluminum smelters, might decrease, as it is probably the case in the US. So here this graph very simply illustrates that, simply the demand for aluminum smelters to decrease, therefore the demand curve will shift inwards and the quantity of labor will decrease from Q1 to Q2. So how can a government address structural unemployment? A long-term solution would be to invest in an education system that promotes greater job mobility, to be able to reconvert oneself, or improve programs to re-educate workers who cannot find jobs anymore, so they can actually get new skills for an occupation that is not threatened by the changes in the structure of the economy. But here, in our case, a more direct and short-term solution would be protectionism. It would mean to implement a tariff or a quota or a subsidy for the aluminum production in the US. A possible solution to the problem that the low aluminum world price poses for the US aluminum production industry would be the imposition of a tariff on aluminum imports. A tariff is simply a tax that is implemented on imports. So, as we can see on this diagram, this will have the effect of shifting the world price or world supply curve upwards. Therefore, the price of aluminum in the US will increase. This means that at the new price, more domestic producers will be willing to supply aluminum. Therefore, domestic production of aluminum will increase. Before the tariff, it was Q1, it is now Q4. And of course, because of that, the proportion of aluminum that was being imported decreased. Before it was foreign producers were importing quantity Q4 to Q2. After the tariff, they're only importing Q4 to Q3. The implementation of a tariff will also increase government revenue. This area represents the amount that foreign producers will have to give the government as a tax. Now, because the price of aluminum has risen because of the tariff in the US, this also means that quantity demanded of aluminum will fall. And this will create a loss of consumer surplus that is represented by that area. This is also a deadweight loss. A deadweight loss is a loss in allocative efficiency. There also will be a loss in productive efficiency that is represented by this area. So this happens because domestic producers are supplying a quantity of aluminum at a higher price than the price at which foreign producers were supplying this quantity before the tariff. Thus, the loss in efficiency. Now, what are the limitations of that policy? Well, most of US aluminum imports come from Canada, actually 48%, so close to half. And the article tells us that there is very little will among policymakers to harm the Canadian aluminum industry. Now, what apparently the US wants to do is to put pressure on the Chinese aluminum production. And this would have very little effect. It would have a derisory effect, given that the US imports only 6% of their aluminum consumption from China.
So one of the solutions that Donald Trump can have to reduce the impact of the Chinese dumping on the US market is to impose a quota. As you can see here, the quota is the limit of imports from a country. So in this case, will be the United States limiting the import of aluminum imported from China. The amount of limitation that the government sets of the aluminum will be Q3 here. This is the quota. So in this diagram, we will demonstrate the effect a quota will have on the revenue gained by domestic and foreign producers, as well as its effect on the supply curve of domestic producers. And we will also mention the inefficiency that may potentially be generated from this imposition of quota. So first, as you can see here, that the supply curve of domestic producers changes from a linear straight line, which is the black, and this part is red. This linear straight line here, which is the S domestic before the imposition of quota. And then after the imposition of quota, this curve changes into this red zigzag shaped line here. It's a curve, so it's red, this shape, the red line here, which is the supply curve of domestic producers after the imposition of quota. So as we know that quantity supplied means the amount of production that producers are able and willing to produce at a given price. So when the prices are below the P-World, which is the world price, the domestic producers who are willing and able to pay, to produce at these prices will still keep their market share. So the supply curve of domestic producers doesn't really change before its intersection point with the P-World. And as the price goes higher, the domestic producers who are willing and able to produce at a price that is higher than the P world will definitely not keep on the production, because it's gonna generate higher loss rather than profit. So for these producers, they will choose to not produce in this market. And now the foreign companies and foreign firms before the quota level will be able to take this part of the share of the market, which is here. This is their revenue between Q1, Q3, and all the way up to P quota here. And as the quota cuts in at this point, that means that the foreign producers are not allowed to produce anymore because there's a strict limit. And now the domestic producers can now cut in to produce for the domestic market. So as you can see now, um, this, the supply curve changes and becomes parallel to its original shaped black curve, the S domestic, and this red S domestic plus quota. So that's the reason behind the shape of the new supply curve. And now we'll talk about the revenue gained by domestic producers and foreign producers. So as you can see that this area is the market share of the domestic producers plus this square here. And now the price level, it's P quota, it's not the P world anymore, because there is a limitation that the government imposes on the amount of imports that's able to get into the country. And both domestic producers and foreign producers would produce at the current equilibrium price level of the domestic market, because why not? So now the revenue gained by domestic producers will be this square, Q0, Q1, and all the way up to P quota, plus the area of Q3, QE, all the way up to PE, P quota, sorry, it's P quota, all the way up to P quota, just got confused. It's Q3, Q4, oh, it's Q3, Q4, and P quota, this giant area here. And now for the foreign producers, which in this case are the Chinese aluminum dumpers, will shrink their revenue, and now their revenue will only be Q1, Q3, and all the way up to P quota, this small square here. Let's just go back to the scenario before the imposition of quota. Before the imposition of quota, the revenue of domestic producers will only be the P world and Q1, this tiny square here. And the revenue shared by the foreign producers will be a much larger square, which is all the way of Q1, between Q1 and Q2, and all the way up to P world, this square, as you can see I'm circling right now. And this will, so the imposition of the quota will definitely generate more revenue for the domestic producers while cutting down the revenue for the foreign producers. And this will make the foreign producers, in this case the Chinese aluminum producers, this will render them less competitive in the US domestic market. Of course, this may generate a deadweight loss and a misallocation of resources. So the deadweight loss, which is also the loss of consumer surplus, will be this red triangle here. As you can see, the consumer surplus before the imposition of quota is this giant triangle here. But after the imposition of the quota, the consumer surplus will decrease into this smaller triangle. Because this square now is shared by this square of loss of consumer surplus will be taken by the domestic producers. And this red triangle here will not be taken by anyone. So this will be the deadweight loss. No, sorry. Yes, the deadweight loss. And it's also the loss of consumer surplus, or in some places they say the loss of the welfare loss. And also this imposition of quota may also generate a misallocation of resources, which is the inefficient production. So that will be the green triangle here. Because as these quantities, the goods and services could have been produced by the foreign producers at a lower price, which is P-World, but now it's produced by the domestic producers at a higher price, and it's all the way up to P-Quota. So this will generate a misallocation of resources.
As said before, China supplies more than half of the total world aluminum supply. This means that they have actually quite a lot of, they are quite powerful in determining what will be the world price. But again, China actually only supplies 6% of the total US aluminum imports. This would mean that any protectionist policy implemented by the US, such as quota, tariffs or subsidies, would have a very little effect on the Chinese aluminum industry. The reason China is able to supply aluminum at such a low price is because the government gives substantial subsidies to that industry. So one way to actually make the world price of aluminum increase would be to find a way to stop these subsidies, these Chinese subsidies to the aluminum industry. And the organization that is capable of doing that is the World Trade Organization. In the last month of the Obama administration, the US government filed a complaint to the World Trade Organization saying that Chinese subsidies gave the Chinese aluminum industry an unfair advantage. And this is probably the most effective way in the long term, to make the aluminum world price increase. On the other hand, a downside of it is that the administrative procedures before any changes can be implemented take a lot of time, so it's very long. Can I do it?
And you just say it.
Yeah. What?
Say it.
You started recording?
Yeah.
What? So what? No, but you have to make it.
I know. I'm gonna cut that off anyway.
Please let me prepare. So, and finally, here is our bibliography with the sources of all the graphs that we used. What else can I say? What else can I say?
It's done. Thank you for watching.
Thank you for what? Wait, no, ZK, we have to re-record that.
Wait, I think let's keep it as like a fun thing.
No.